Morning, everyone. I hope everyone is having a very, very fine meeting so far. But I have to tell you, the moment is now. And again, you may wonder, why am I standing up here? Well, I've been called to introduce the Lord of the Lords, the man by the name of Lord Christopher Monckton of Branchley. I guess it's rather appropriate that I will introduce him. Of course, I'll let him speak, but in terms of my connection to Monckton, I have to say that he's the one who got me in trouble. In any way, I don't know where Christopher is. Are you here, Christopher?
Yes, I am.
Okay, then we're ready to go. Let's enjoy Christopher Monckton. Thank you.
My lords, that's me. Ladies and gentlemen, what a delight that here we are again at what is now the 12th Heartland Conference. You have persevered through decades of the vileness that has been thrown at you by the forces of darkness, none more so than poor Willie Soon. And indeed it was I who got him into trouble, because I invited him to co-author a paper that was a blameless paper on climate science and climate sensitivity, published last January in 2016 in the Science Bulletin of the Chinese Academy of Sciences, and the left went ballistic. And they subjected Willie to some of the nastiest, most savage personal attacks I have ever seen. All I can tell you is that from my now quite long and happy personal acquaintance with Willie, every word of that poison was incorrect, and can we give him a thunderous standing ovation? Well, that is the easiest standing ovation I've ever obtained, and it's also the most enthusiastic. And Willie, God bless you, and God bless all of you who have been subjected to the vile attacks of those who are unwilling to debate this matter at a level of economics and science, a debate which has been conducted here with remarkably good humour now for 12 successive conferences. Now, if anyone is watching this either live or on YouTube and has any questions for me about this presentation, you will see my email address on the screen now. It is monckton@mail.com. Very simple, monckton@mail.com, and I will do my best to answer your queries. I will also be taking questions after this presentation. Now, I have noticed there has been a change of administration here in the United States since I was last here. But I do have to say something in the friendliest possible way to the Trump administration. Make America great again. I am delighted that, against all odds, the Republicans prevailed, because they have been the party that has had a debate within their ranks about the climate, and they concluded after that debate that what is going on in climate science is unacceptable, and that the drastic increases in the cost of electricity and of gasoline as a result of trying to make non-existent global warming go away would hit the poorest hardest. And no small part of the reason why Mr. Trump did so well in the Rust Belt states, in the places where they make things and grow things and dig things, is that they knew that he was on their side. He spoke for the ordinary working man, and the ordinary working man responded in the only way that you can in a democracy. They put their cross in the box in the right place. One of the strangest emails I've had in the last few weeks was from Joe Bast. And he said, "I've often had a longing to wear dreadlocks." Now, I can't remember why he said this, but I just wondered whether any of you would like to see what Joe Bast looks like in dreadlocks. Do I take that as a yes? And this somewhat embarrassing slide does give me the opportunity to say a very heartfelt thanks on behalf of all of us to Joe and Diane and all their wonderful team at the Heartland Institute for their astonishing diligence, persistence and risk-taking in holding this conference in the hope that they will be able to raise enough money to pay for it. So can we give them also a standing ovation? And just in case you would like a permanent embarrassing record of this, you can do what Willie is doing and take a picture of it. Well, now, climate extremism is part of the long totalitarian attack on democracy. And one of the saddest things for me is to see how the once democratic party here in the United States has slid into a disfiguring totalitarianism in recent decades. And it is very clear that when Mr. Trump won the election, and he won it fair and square, they didn't like that. And this is what happened. You had these custard-faced zombies, just look at them, walking through the streets, saying, "He's not my president." Well, in a democracy, yes, he is. And then there was violence, and there was the usual stupidity at the so-called University of so-called California, where they invited speakers, a thing that happens to me about once a month somewhere in the world, and generally rioted and behaved in a stupid way and set off fireworks and caused damage. And this is not how democracy is supposed to work. Interestingly, I was interested to find out why the universities are to the left in the way that they are now, because it's gone a long way since I was at Cambridge, and the opinion was as evenly divided there as it was in the country. That is no longer the case. I went to King's College, Cambridge, shortly before Mr. Trump's election, and I was asked to give a talk to the Politics Society there. There were 100 undergraduates in the room, and the question was, does Trump have a point? There were 3 Marxist lecturers. There was the deputy editor of The Spectator, supposedly a conservative newspaper. None of them on the panel felt that Trump had a point. I was the only one who did. And I asked those 100 undergraduates 4 questions. 1, did you vote or would you have voted for Brexit? 2, do you think there should be more spending on defence? 3, do you think there should be some better control of immigration? And 4, what about climate change? Has it been exaggerated a little bit? And I had predicted that less than 10% of them would have voted for Brexit and less than 5% for the other 3. You'll see the figures there. It was 5%, 3%, 2% and 1%, respectively. This is an ideological monoculture of the most extraordinary kind. And that can only occur when the indoctrination at school and at university of our children is so thorough and so complete that they themselves are unaware that they have been indoctrinated. So what then is the origin of this astonishing change in the media, in the universities, in the churches, in the unions, in big business, in big politics, in everywhere where power is exercised or influence is wielded? How have virtually all of these centres of power gone to the very far totalitarian left so very quickly? How is it that now we are told that there is no truth outside the party line? Scrub that, no truth outside the consensus, which is the exciting new rebranding of the party line. How has this come about so suddenly? Hands up all those of you who know who this is. I see not a single hand, and the reason for that is that this is the most influential man of the 20th century and arguably of the beginning of the 21st. His name is Ion Mihai Pacepa. Has anybody heard of him? No. He was the head of the Securitate, the secret police in Ceausescu's Romania. But that's not what makes him interesting to us in the West. He was appointed shortly after the Second World War as the head of a new division of the KGB called the Desinformatia Directorate. And disinformation had only one task: to recruit willing communists in the West who would not be paid, and all they had to do was to take every opportunity to worm their way into the media and into positions of influence, and then use those positions to denigrate the reputations of those who had proved effective in opposing the Communist Party line anywhere in the world. That's all they did. Now, I knew this was going on when I was at Cambridge. A friend of mine who was a Marxist was invited for an interview at the BBC, and he came back smiling like the cat that got the cream. So I said to him, "So you went to the interview, they asked you the question, you said yes, and they gave you the job." He said, "How did you know?" I said, "The question was, are you a Marxist? You said yes, and you got the job." And he's still there. And that's how the BBC recruited, and to a very large extent, they still do, because this was the effect of Pacepa. Now, you may think, well, this is just one man. How much influence did he really have? When he came out, this is the first time I've been able to talk about this, because under the 30-year rule, it was all classified before. But he was debriefed. And the thing that surprised us was the extent of what he'd done. There were 1 million Soviet agents of influence who were Western communists who were attached to and in contact with the Disinformation Directorate. That was how large it was over a period of 40 years. And that is why, just in my lifetime from university until now, this astonishing lurch to the far totalitarian left has occurred in the media and elsewhere. That is what we are up against. And it's a self-perpetuating thing, even though there's no longer a KGB, and Pacepa has now come out to the West, and you can now, I'm glad to say, read his book about this. He's written a book explaining what he did, how his first target was Pope Pius XII, who he made out, quite falsely, to be a Nazi-loving Jew-hater, when the chief rabbi and his deputy in Rome after the war both became Catholics because the Pope had done so much for the Jews. But after a few years, people started believing this. There may even be a few people here who have been exposed to that propaganda somewhere along the line. And because they couldn't handle 1 million agents directly, they began training them so that they would recruit others, and it would become self-perpetuating. And that's why this is still going on long after the KGB has gone. And you now see its influence in Copenhagen in 2009, when for the first time since the Berlin Wall came down, the hated symbol of a tyranny that has killed 250 million people worldwide and counting was openly flaunted in the streets by Marxists. So what are we going to do? First of all, why have we got reason to doubt this so-called consensus on the climate? Because again, it's a largely left-driven so-called consensus. Well, the first reason is that there isn't a consensus. The consensus proposition, which says no more than that most of the warming since 1950 was caused by us, is in fact 0.3% in the scientific literature. But the people who did the survey reported it as 97.1% because they were communists. And they didn't care about the truth. They cared about the party line, and the party line said 97%. So that's what they said. And to this day, even though our peer-reviewed result showing that it's 0.3% in exactly the same set of papers has been published long since, not a single news medium has ever reported the truth of this figure. They still go on chattering about 97%. We can also see this influence in the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which one might almost call a communist front organisation. So vicious is its disregard for any sort of objective scientific truth. But the graph that you see there from the 2007 assessment report of the IPCC is an extremely influential one. It was that graph which led the Republican Party finally to realize that the siren voices of the Democrats saying, let us join together in a bipartisan approach to solve the supposed problem of climate change, should not be heeded, and that they should instead tackle the science of climate change rather than arguing only on the economics as they had until then, and that they should start realizing that the climate change science was not all that it was cracked up to be. Now, this came about because a few years ago I was giving testimony in front of a committee of Congress, and the then ranking Republican member on the committee was Congressman John Linder, now retired. I showed this graph to the caucus of the Republicans in their lounge before we went into the main meeting with the Democrats. And John Linder took one look at this. This shows the quality of legislators you still have here in the States. I wish we had them too. He took one look and he said, they can't have done that. And I said to him, they did. And he turned to the rest of the room and he said, gentlemen, we have seen in this one graph all we need to see about the IPCC and whether any reliance whatsoever can be placed upon it. We can place no reliance upon it. And so some of them then said, could you explain? I said, John, leave this to me. And I said, here are these 4 trend lines correctly calculated and positioned on the correct representation of the then Hadcroot data set, showing how temperature has changed globally over the last 150 years. Now, the conclusion that was drawn from this graph was that because the trend lines that started more towards the present, which is my end of the graph, were steeper than the others, therefore the rate of global warming was accelerating, and we were to blame, a complete non sequitur there. But the truth of it is there were 2 previous periods, as you can see there, when the rate of warming was exactly the same as in the most recent 25-year period. So there had been no acceleration, though there is a gentle upward trend overall in the graph, as you can see from the red trend line that covers the whole thing. So if you take a sine wave, there is a sine wave. What is the trend of a sine wave? It's a zero trend by definition. But you can use the IPCC's technique and look, bingo, we've now got a sine wave going up at an ever more accelerating rate. When I showed this graph on my first tour of Australia many years ago, Bob Carter was on the tour as well, and he came up to me after, he said, this is astonishing. He said, that's how I show that that graph is bogus. Well, great minds think alike. Now, the IPCC has begun to realize that it has been over-predicting. And you can see here some evidence of that. This is actually a postage stamp-sized corner of a graph in the IPCC's 5th assessment report, but my large and able staff were able to enlarge it so that you can see the huge discrepancy between observation and the predictions of the 2 most recent generations of IPCC models. If you go back to 1990, to the first assessment report, the zone in pink there, that was what they predicted. And even after all the adjustments that have been made upwards, ever upwards, to the global temperature records because they weren't showing enough warming, all 5 of the longest standing records, 2 satellite at the bottom and 3 non-satellite further up, that zone marked what happened. That is the measured temperature change. And it's entirely below the vast range of predictions made by the IPCC in 1990, from which an honourable man would deduce that maybe their way of doing climate sensitivity might have some problems with it. They themselves have adjusted downwards their medium-term projections at my insistence. I was an expert reviewer for the last report. But they refused the suggestion of me and other reviewers that they should also similarly reduce their long-term predictions. They weren't prepared to go away from the predictions made by Jules Charney in his report for the National Science Council here in the United States back in 1979, almost 40 years ago, that the central estimate of global warming is 3 Celsius with plus or minus this enormous range of 1.5 Celsius. And after 40 years and tens of billions of dollars, that has not changed. And they are unable to constrain climate sensitivity. So my team has been looking at this. But before we get to it, I want to look at who have we got to convince if we're really going to win this debate. The temptation is to think we've got the Trump administration there, we've won, that's it, let's celebrate. But there have been some notes of caution sounded in this room yesterday that this is a temporary relief. How can we make it permanent? Who have we got to convince in order that we can make it permanent? First of all, the merchants of fake news, who will not report our side of the case either accurately or in most cases at all. Now, that is not how news media are supposed to operate. When I was a journalist, we faithfully gave both sides of the argument, even if the paper might incline itself to one side or the other. You gave both sides so that the readers could, to a large extent, make up their own minds. This is no longer the case because Pacepa's people have taken over the mainstream news media. That's why Willie Soon had such a hard time, and they would not print his side of the story. And not one of the trustees of the Smithsonian, when I wrote to each of them personally, would even acknowledge that I had written to them. Not even Chief Justice Roberts of the Supreme Court, whom I now call upon to resign for his failure to act. Then there are the fake news merchants on YouTube. And I shall be appearing on YouTube, but I am in a special area which isn't fake news. But this is Arnold Schwarzenegger calling for those who disagree with his expert opinion on climate science to be killed. Now, Joe Bast and I and several others here have complained over and over again to YouTube to ask for this to be taken down. This is an extremely nasty piece of hate speech. It is still there. I checked yesterday. And it's been there now for over a year. And so the only answer to that, Google owns YouTube, is to boycott Google. And I'm pleased to report that as of today, as a result of Google not having addressed this and other instances of hate speech and extremist rhetoric that appear all over its websites, now some $480 million worth of advertising has been pulled from Google by most of its largest clients, and I urge the remainder of them to do the same as quickly as possible. We also have to convince Waxman and Markey, the authors of the Cap and Trade Bill. I have elevated them to the peerage because that means they will have no further influence on politics at all. We have to convince Rex Tillerson. Now, he was the chief executive officer of ExxonMobil. He's now the Secretary of State. He has always been, at best, equivocal on the climate question. And my spies inside the administration, who are numerous and devoted, have told me that he is one of the chief foci of resistance to Mr. Trump honouring a promise that he wishes to honour, which is to withdraw forthwith, not only from the Paris Climate Agreement, but also from the UNFCCC, because if you withdraw from the UNFCCC, you only have to give 1 year's notice, and it automatically takes you out of Paris. Give notice under Paris, and it's 3 years. So we need to convince the vacillators like Tillerson that they've got to get on with the job that the administration was elected to do. We've also got to make sure that Ivanka Trump and her husband Jared Kushner, who are typical rich Manhattan, and I won't use the word progressive and I won't use the word liberal, they are illiberals. That's what the left now are. They are illiberal. Don't call them liberal. There's nothing liberal about them anymore. And Gore has been talking to Ivanka, and we've got to persuade not only Ivanka, we've got to persuade Gore that he is wrong. This is the task I am setting myself in this presentation. The one group we don't have to convince that this is nonsense are, of course, the miners. I had the pleasure of addressing America's miners on the top of a mountain in West Virginia on Labor Day a few years ago. And 100,000 mine workers and their families and friends turned up. It is the largest audience I have ever addressed. They were a wonderful, friendly crowd. They were genuinely interested and relieved to hear there was no need for Obama's war on coal, scientifically speaking. And so they proved to be very strong supporters of Mr. Trump. But Mr. Trump himself is still going to need to be persuaded to carry out that campaign promise when Gore and Ivanka and Tillerson are telling him not to. Then, of course, we've even got to go for the really extreme extremists. On the left, you have Mr. Obama, and on the extreme left, come all the way around to the right, you have John Cook, the author of that bogus paper about the 97% consensus, and that is how he dresses up in his spare time. We are even going to try to convince them. And yes, we can. There is a way, and I'm going to use the word compel, to compel the assent of all the categories that I have shown there, even the most irredentist true believers in the Communist Party line on climate, we can compel their assent. And the way we do this is to recognize that at the moment, until now, the debate on both sides has largely been a competition between conjectures. Now, in mathematics, a conjecture is something where the science isn't settled. We think that something may be true, but we can't actually prove it. One of the most famous unresolved conjectures in mathematics is on the screen at the top there. First of all, the formal mathematical logical definition, and then in simpler terms, what it means, which is that every composite number is the mean of two prime numbers. Now, I have recently stumbled upon another conjecture related to that, which I show at the bottom there, which is that certain of the partitions of 2n there have divisors, and if you count the number of positions that have these qualifying divisors, and the ratio of those partitions to the number of qualifying divisors in all of them for any n, is asymptotic to the Godin ratio conjugate phi apud infinitatem. It's a most extraordinary result. Never before had anyone suspected that this is the case. It does appear to be the case, and by numerical verification I think it's the case, but I can't prove it. However much we may think it's true, however much it would be beautiful if it were. And that's a conjecture. Now, if we're going to convince people, we have to do what James Garfield did. He was your 20th president. In 1876, he was having a conversation with some of his fellow representatives, people of the mental quality of John Linder, about mathematics, and he came across a fascinating demonstration and reported here in the April 1876 edition of the New England Journal of Education. He found a demonstration of the Pythagorean theorem. And here is that demonstration. On the left you have a trapezoid. On the right you have three triangles, two of them congruent right-angled triangles, the third an isosceles one. And the simple equations on the right of that demonstrate that this conclusively and in all cases proves the Pythagorean theorem. But the interesting thing about this is that this is similar to many other similar proofs by what is called dissection. Here is Aryabhata at the beginning of the 6th century AD. Here is Tabit ibn Qurra, again using a dissection proof in the middle of the 9th century AD. And here is even Monckton at the end of the 20th century doing a proof by inclusion. Now, what is fascinating is that in all cultures, from the Babylonians to the ancient early imperial Chinese to all these Easterners and the West, we all agree that this is true. Doesn't matter what our politics, whether we're totalitarians, libertarians, in all ages, this is true. There is nothing more true than a mathematical truth in those areas, which are not all areas, in which mathematics can establish that something is definitely true. So what we have to find then is something, and this is how the editor reported this in 1876, something on which the members of both houses can agree without distinction of party. That was the remark that I found, because I'm fascinated by the history of mathematics, and I found this remark and I thought, there is the clue. What we have to do is to find a demonstration that will convince the opponents. And so what formal demonstration then can we find? We need to find a formal demonstration that there are material errors in official climate physics. And if we can, in particular, find material errors that lead to exaggerations, and large exaggerations at that, in the determination of climate sensitivity, the first thing that goes is the consensus notion, because the consensus has simply been wrong for 40 years. Likewise, warming will turn out to be small and beneficial, and then, of course, the social cost of carbon actually turns out to be a social benefit. So that's what happens if we can prove that they screwed up. Now, here is their way of determining climate sensitivity. It's that simple equation that does it. Now, there are various things wrong with that equation, in my opinion. All three of the inputs to it are exaggerated, but I can only prove that the input of one of them is exaggerated. I can also prove, and I'm going to show you both of these proofs, that the form of the equation is erroneous and leads to a large exaggeration. So first of all, we want to see that, as you see, it goes into two halves. There's the CO2 bit of the equation, which is that little yellow box at the left-hand side, And then with the big red bracket, that's the effect of temperature feedbacks, consequential upon the direct warming caused by the CO2, which is that tiny little square at the left-hand end. You see the IPCC range is conservative compared with some of the very extreme papers that have been appearing in the literature. But you can also see that the thick end of the problem is to do with these temperature feedbacks. So these are the principal feedbacks. You can see them there. This is taken from the fifth assessment report of the IPCC. It's just handy to see what they all are. And they sum to a feedback sum, which is denominated in watts per square meter per Kelvin. Here is the various estimates of the CMIP5 models of the feedback sum. And you'll see that one extreme outlier, it's actually a French model on the right-hand side towards me, over there, and towards you over there, that is what gives them their high-end predictions of climate sensitivity dependent on just one of the models. The others are much more conservative. But we can take the values, the range of values of this climate feedback sum, and we can feed that back into the equation we started with to calibrate the equation by showing that we, by doing that, can reproduce more or less, very closely anyway, the results that are officially declared by the IPCC. So that verifies that this is the equation they are using. Now, we're going to demonstrate, first of all, that the CO2 forcing has been exaggerated by 40%. Now, it's Professor Will Happer who is the person who discovered this, and he gave this result at the World Federation of Scientists annual meeting in Sicily 2 years ago, and I was privileged to be there when he announced it, to the astonishment of the many true-believing scientists who were in the room. They didn't like it, but they couldn't fault it. Now, in order to determine how much forcing you get from CO2, you need to have what's called a line shape equation, a generalized version of which is at the top there. Then there are two particular kinds which are usually used. There are the Lorentzian and the Voigt equations. And you will see that these are quite intractable partial differentials. And so handling these is always a nightmare. And for the sake of simplicity, optical physicists, who are the people who developed these equations, use a simplification by which they do not have, and you can see this there, any variable for time in the equation. And the climate scientists, not understanding this, borrowed these equations from optical physics, which is Will Happer's specialist subject, without realizing that they had this defect. And in optical physics, it doesn't matter most of the time, but when you're trying to use this as a basis for determining climate sensitivity, it does. Because these collisions between molecules and photons occur not instantaneously, as these equations, as you can see, indicate. Instead, they occur over a period of approximately 1.6 picoseconds. And that difference, tiny though it is, overlooked by the climate scientists who didn't understand the math, means that they have overstated the direct forcing of CO2 and therefore climate sensitivity by 40%. And it's as simple as that. There you can see the difference between what they predict and what actually happens. You'll see that the differences are largely at the far wings of the absorption band, principal absorption band in this case, of CO2. And you'll see how it is that they have actually been able to measure this by taking a satellite, and it takes tangential readings, and you get two different kinds of reading depending on whether you assume instantaneity or you assume that the collisions take the time they are known to take. So here is the Happer effect. We started out with that line at the top where some of the extremist papers are saying you might get 13 Celsius of warming per doubling of CO2, and that comes down to absolute maximum of 9, but actually not more than about 3 Celsius at the top end if you use the IPCC's assumptions but correct for this error. Because it doesn't only make the CO2 box smaller, it becomes green and a bit smaller, but because the size of the feedbacks is dependent on the size of the forcing, the feedbacks get smaller as well. So that already is a very good start. And now we're going to demonstrate that the high-end effect of temperature feedbacks has also been exaggerated, and this is an even larger exaggeration. And again, this is a formal demonstration. And if we are right about this, then there is no argument about it, and they're going to have to accept that it's all over. Now, it's been known for some time, this is a famous paper by Guy Callender in 1938, that various negative feedbacks and stabilizing mechanisms exist in the climate. And we can see in this long record from Juzel et al. 2007, going back 810,000 years, reconstructing global mean surface temperature from the ratios of two different isotopes of the carbon in the air trapped in ice cores in Antarctica, you can see that the variance either side of the long-term average there is only about 3 Celsius up or down. That's enough to give you an ice age at the bottom end and hothouse Earth at the other, and we're somewhere in between at the moment. But it's not enough to posit the very large feedbacks that are imagined by the IPCC. And it was looking at this graph, which Willie had sent me, that I began to realize we had to work rather hard on finding out what they'd got wrong. This is the team that has been wrestling with this problem. They're a very distinguished crowd. There's Matt Briggs, who is the statistician to the stars. There's Dave Leagates, who apologizes he can't be here. His mother is very ill, and we send her our best wishes. There is Michael Limburg, who is here. There's me. There's James Morrison, who's an undergraduate at the University of East Anglia, who has very much made his presence felt here at this conference. And he is studying environmental sciences at East Anglia, but he has realized where the truth actually lies. And I think he should be given a very warm round of applause for that. And finally, of course, there's Willie Soon, who's our rocket scientist, who keeps us all straight because he just knows everything about everything. He's extraordinarily knowledgeable. So we started out by plotting this graph, which is the graph of the temperature response to various feedback factors. And you will see that if Dick Lindzen is right that feedbacks are actually negative, then you're only going to get about 1 Celsius of warming per doubling of CO2, possibly even less. If you take the IPCC, then you're going to get 1.5 to 4.5 Celsius, and you can see a very wide range of possible feedback values, and it's that wide range of feedback values that leads to the wide range of climate sensitivities. That's why they can't constrain it. And then the extremist papers, and you'll see what happens there when you get towards the right-hand end of the positive end of this hyperbola. This is actually a rectangular hyperbola. Then you get these very extreme predictions. And it's seeing those extreme predictions that made me realize they hadn't a clue what they were doing. Now, I knew about this curve, so when I plotted it, I recognized it at once because I'm a classical architect by training, and I was given training in the mathematics of what are called the conic sections. And in particular, this graph, the rectangular form of the hyperbola, where the axes of the hyperbola are orthogonal to one another, and therefore they can be used as Cartesian coordinates, in effect. This was first used by Menaichmus of Alopekonissos. You'll see where that is now in Asia Minor. In 340 BC, to solve one of the most intractable problems in ancient mathematics, the problem of the duplication of the cube. This was the first known use of what are now recognized as Cartesian coordinates, and what he did was to plot the rectangular hyperbola, overlay it with a parabola, and at the intersection of these two curves is the one real solution to the duplication of the cube. And he was the first to solve this long-standing problem. So I had quite a lot of knowledge of this particular curve. Then I had to look at the feedbacks, which are canonical at the moment. And always there is one paper in each IPCC report which gives all these official values. It was Soden and Held in 2006 for the 2007 report, and it was Vial et al. 2013 for the 2013 report. And you'll see there the estimates of feedbacks. And the important thing is not so much the magnitude of the feedback sum as the fact of these huge variances either side. One standard deviation is 20% of the central estimate. In order to be a 95% certain you've got things right, therefore, you're going to have to go 40% up or down on the central estimate of the feedback sum and hence of the feedback factor. And you'll see the difference it makes where on the hyperbolic curve you do this calculation. If you do it towards the left, exactly the same variance in the feedback sum will give you only a very tiny variance in climate sensitivity. You can constrain climate sensitivity if the calculation comes out at that end of the curve. If it's at this end of the curve, over here, at the right-hand end, a whale away from the origin, where it starts to shoot up towards infinity, then for exactly the same variance in the feedback factor, you get an enormous variance in climate sensitivity. And that, of course, is what the IPCC and the extremist papers do. So here you can see it much more clearly, the 1.5 and 4.5 Celsius bounds of climate sensitivity. The IPCC no longer declares a central estimate. I'm going to show you why it doesn't, because they have previously said it's 3 Celsius. But in fact, the Charney report originally said that if you look at the one-dimensional models, it's 2.4 Celsius. Why? Well, let's just move that, and you can see now that if you take the central estimate of the feedback sum and put it in the middle where it should be, then it reads off at about 2.25 Celsius on this particular graph here. And he had a slightly higher value because they were using a higher value for the CO2 forcing at the time. But 2.25 Celsius is where the central estimate should now be. So we've already cut the central estimate down by 0.75 Celsius just by doing that. We now have to go to this little text book here. This is the 10th edition in 10 years. This is the 1955 edition of the standard work on electronic network analysis and feedback amplifier design. Why is this important? Because the mathematics of feedbacks in all dynamical systems, including the climate, comes from electronic circuitry, where you can design a feedback in exactly. You will see here that the inputs and outputs to a feedback circuit, the voltages, these are absolute values. They are not deltas. They are not changes. They are the absolute values. That's how you do the sum correctly. Here is a feedback circuit lifted straight from page 31 of Bode's book. You can see the input line there. You can see the generator generating the input voltage, not the change in voltage, the whole input voltage. If you want to change the voltage, you do that in the amplifier, that triangle at the top, and the amplification factor is called mu. Then you come to the output node. Then you go back downwards via the beta feedback amplifier back into the summation or input node, and round it goes. And the mathematics of handling this is very well understood, and this very simple circuit is exactly the same as what is used in the climate. And if we therefore start using temperature instead of the voltage, then you get this graph here. This is the correct way to do it. And these are the main formulae that you get out, and in particular, the amount by which you multiply the initial temperature to get the final temperature, allowing for the feedbacks, is at the bottom right here. It's mu divided by 1 minus mu beta. And if you want to prove that, then I have proved it here. Bode actually doesn't do this because it's already well understood at that time, but I have proved it just for the sake of completion. And here is how this is a partly correct way of doing it, but this time putting the values on it, because the way the IPCC and all the models do it, they don't use a separate amplifier. They simply add the change in temperature to the input temperature, and then they feed it through, and you get the answer. And I've tuned this so that it gives the answer of 2.25 Kelvin that I showed you earlier. But look how tiny the feedback factor is, 0.005 roughly. And that's a unitless variable. Now, that's the purple circle at the bottom there. Now, that is a kind of more or less correct way of it. Again, we're using the absolute value of the input. We're adding, in this case, the delta to it. And we've got an absolute value of the output. But they don't do that. What they do is this. They put the delta in, and they get the delta out. Just the change in temperature goes in and out. The consequence of that is we still get exactly the same answer. But look at what has happened to the feedback factor. Because the input and output are 2 orders of magnitude too small, the feedback factor is 2 orders of magnitude too big, which pushes the calculation artificially and incorrectly towards that extreme end of the hyperbola, and therefore you get these very extreme values of climate sensitivity. Here we can show the 2 approaches in equation form. This is the right way to do it. You get 2.25K, and you get this tiny, in purple there, value of beta, which is the feedback factor. Here, F is their feedback factor. You can see it's 2 orders of magnitude too big. And if we go back to this curve and home in on this top left corner of it, you can see that the effect of pushing it away from just to the right of the origin at 0, which is where it should be done, and putting it where the IPCC puts it, you immediately get this huge exaggeration in climate sensitivity. Push it even further, and you get the silly values in the more extreme papers. Here is a plot which shows how it should look compared with how it does look. The dotted lines are what they predict will happen. You can see that vast area at the top labelled current method. That is all the extreme predictions arising solely from this error. And the grey zone in the middle is much more conservative, and at the top end you get far less warming. And so if we now combine my result with that of HAPA, you can see that climate sensitivity comes plummeting down. And to show this in figures, at the bottom line there, climate sensitivity is no longer, as it is at the top, 1.53, 4.5K. It's 1.3, 1.6, 1.9 before you start doing anything else to query whether the feedbacks are positive or negative and all the other things that might be wrong. And we can prove this. This is the point. It's not a matter for debate. It is a matter which is proven. Now, how have we verified this? Because I, like Ron Reagan, trust but verify is what he said. Well, we're skeptics, so we don't trust, but we do try to verify. Now, an expert on the electricity supply industry in London, Alex Henney, asked for a copy of my paper because he'd heard about this. It is circulating quite rapidly in samizdat now. He sent it to an electronics engineer who's a friend of his, who said, oh, that result looks weird. I will build an electronic feedback circuit to test it, because you could do that very precisely with an electronic circuit. And this is his conclusion, that we have indeed established correct values, and therefore this does greatly reduce climate sensitivity. We then sent it to Will Happer, who said, the paper is too long. So I did it again, and he said, I like this paper. Then we sent it to God himself, and that is Professor Ray Bates at University College Dublin, with whom I debated this issue many years ago in front of the Law Society of Ireland. And at that time I had showed this hyperbolic graph. I hadn't at that stage discovered what they'd done wrong, but it was clear that graph didn't represent how the climate operated. And he went white when he saw the graph, and he wrote to me afterwards saying, there is something wrong here, I'm going to work on it. And 3 years later he got in touch and said, I still can't see what they've done wrong, but I can show that it was wrong. And he has published a paper earlier last year saying so. So I sent it to Ray Bates, and that was his comment. He spent 3 weeks looking at it, and eventually he said, the paper has a strong logic, I will be very happy to act as a reviewer for it. This is the man who has more expertise in the application of feedback mathematics to the climate than anyone else on Earth. So we have some growing confidence that we are right about this. But if you're watching this and you think we're wrong, please write and tell me what we've done wrong. Now, the consequences of low sensitivity can be done very briefly. If you do a discounting to what is called present value, and the rationale for that is on your screens now. It's the bird in the hand rule that $1 today is worth more to us than $1 100 years hence in the pockets of our sticky grandchildren. So this is the basis of intertemporal discounting, and you will see there the absurd assumption in the Stern report, which was that they justified the use of a 0.1% social discount rate by saying, well, there's a 1 in 10 chance that because of global warming, the world will come to an end by the end of the 21st century. That was the basis on which all of this governmental expenditure is based. It's plainly bonkers, but you never see anyone point this out. So I thought I would show that to you. And so he uses finally an overall discount rate of 1.4%. The US Treasury uses 7%. The minimum market discount rate is actually 5%. And if you use a lower rate of discount than that, you don't only harm the present generation, you harm future generations as well by reducing the wealth that is left to them. And this is Václav Klaus, again at the World Federation of Scientists, pointing this out. He came at my invitation, gave a wonderful talk. And the market rate, as he says here, is 5%. Now, if you use this simple economic equation here to convert the 1.4% discount rate of Stern to a 5% rate, and do that over 100 years, you find that Stern's best estimate of what it might cost in GDP terms not to act on global warming, which is at the rate of warming we're actually seeing, it's only 3% of GDP. That comes down to 0.5% of GDP. If you then take into account what Will Happer and we have done to prove that the values he was relying upon are in fact excessive, then you're looking at a negligible GDP cost if we never do anything about global warming at all, because frankly there isn't going to be much of it. For more details of the economic aspects of this, I recommend an excellent publication which is forthcoming called Climate Change Reconsidered 3, The Horror Story. And, of course, the Heartland and Joe Bast in particular and Fred Singer must be given, I think, a huge round of applause for the devotion that they have shown in producing these documents. When you think of the billions that are spent by the IPCC to produce rubbish, and then these huge reports are produced by Joe and his team on practically thin air, they get virtually nothing to do this work. It is astonishing that they have devoted so much of their lives and their time and their energy to producing true science rather than bogus science. Now, John Cook, he of the bogus consensus and the Nazi uniform, produced this slide, which shows on the left Anthony Watts, on the right James Dellingpole, and in the centre the unknown soldier. And what this does illustrate is that the other side are beginning to realise just how muscular our side of the case actually is. And why is it so muscular? It is thanks to all of you, because you have stood firm and unwavering behind our leaders, the Heartland Institute, as we resist the forces of communist darkness and the forces of totalitarian control. And we have upheld the rights and liberties that your founding fathers always wished for you to have. And every time one reads virtually anything said or spoken by Jefferson, one weeps for the sheer strength of those founding fathers' commitment to freedom and also to the scientific truth. And if you depart from scientific truth, it's very easy to find excuses for departing from freedom. And that is why the totalitarians have made up this nonsense. But I can now, as a result of the mathematics I have had the pleasure of showing to you this morning, say that the scare is over. And it is here on this soil of freedom, the soil of freedom on which I always love to stand. It is here, with the Trump administration, with the Heartland Institute, with the willingness of scientists who are true scientists and true lovers of truth and freedom. It is here in this country that the truth will once again be made to prevail and eventually made to prevail worldwide. And so I'm going to end, as I have once or twice before, with the words of Winston Churchill, addressed to your great nation at the darkest hour in the Second World War. He said this, from Longfellow, he said, "Sail on, O ship of state. Sail on, O Union, strong and great. Humanity, with all its fears, with all the hopes of future years, is hanging breathless on thy fate." Thank you. Thank you. Well, I don't know whether we have time for questions. I had to get quite a lot of mathematics in there, but perhaps one or two? Very good. Who was the first question?
Hi.
Oh, Larry, yes. This is Professor Lawrence Gould, the University of Hartford, Connecticut, a very distinguished, largely self-taught physicist. But that doesn't mean he doesn't know anything. He is one of the most diligent and expert physicists I've had the pleasure to come across. And Larry, it's a great joy that you're here. How can I help?
I don't know whether I should sit down now or just ask. From what I see, you pretty much are hanging the IPCC with their own petard using their equation. But I'm wondering to what extent the other issues that should come up in discussing climate change have been taken into account by the people who are criticizing the IPCCs. Where's the Pacific Decadal Oscillation, the AMO, the cosmic connection of Svensmark, you know? What happens about all the manipulation of the data, the homogenization? It seems to be a bloody mess. I mean, and this is only part of what you said.
This is a very fair question. One should not hang one's hat only on a single point. The virtue of the approach that we have on my team, and Will Happer has also done, have attempted to take, is to find something which has the character of a theorem. It has the character of a proof. It is undeniable. There is no argument about this. If we are right, and that's a matter we might discuss later because your input onto this will be extremely valuable, but if we are right in what we have found here, then there is no argument about it. You can argue about the extent of the cosmic ray connection. You can argue about the Pacific Decadal Oscillation. We are probably right in our view on all these points, but we can't actually prove it. And when you're trying to convince that list of people that I showed there, who are really intractable, many of them are communists, you've got to try and convince them that they can't get out of it. This is where Garfield's hint is so important, that this is something that both parties can agree upon without distinction of party. That's what I'm going for here, and that's why in this particular presentation I focused only on these two mathematical errors. That doesn't mean there are not many other problems with climate science. There are, and once we have established that we no longer have to worry about global warming, and I think with luck we have now established that, and if you're watching on YouTube and you disagree, please write in and tell me scientifically why you disagree so that we can have a debate about this. But if we're right that we have proved that climate sensitivity using the IPCC's assumptions cannot exceed 2 Celsius degrees even at the high end, and is more likely to be about 1.5, then that's the end of the climate scare, and it's at that point we can, to quote a phrase, drain the swamp. Yes, sir.
Leo Goldstein from DeFi-CCC.com. In one word, can you summarize it? So are the feedback to the so-called radiative forcing, so are the feedbacks negative as they were expected from the beginning, or there are still positive feedbacks?
Right. What I have done, again a very fair question, is to assume ad argumentum, just for the purposes of this presentation, that we will simply take, as I showed, the latest values for feedback sums from the CMIP5 generation of models relied upon by the IPCC and quantified explicitly in Vial et al. 2013. Now, I privately agree very strongly with the excellent work done by Richard Lindzen and his postdoc student Young-Sang Choi in 2009 and updated in 2011. Likewise with Roy Spencer at UAH and his mathematical colleague Braswell in 2010, updated in 2011, and also with a more recent paper by the formidable radiative physicist Hermann Harder, which came out, I think, last year. All of these find climate sensitivity to be of order 0.7 Celsius, about half of the value that we have come to here, because they are all, in their different ways, assuming that feedbacks are, as you mentioned, quite pronouncedly negative. And we would expect that they would be negative, or at best only a tiny bit positive, because otherwise the climate circuit would be far less stable than it has proven to be over the last 810,000 years. So I privately think that Dick Lindzen and all the others I've mentioned are right, in which case our analysis is unnecessary. However, they can't absolutely prove that they're right. And we think that what we've done here is to absolutely prove that we are right. And that means that we can constrain climate sensitivity to less than 2 Celsius per doubling, and therefore there's absolutely no need to spend another red cent on global warming ever again.
This will be the last question.
Right.
Last one? Okay. Sir, good morning.
Good morning.
Monckton. Please Could you please recall for all of us your United Nations definition of spade?
I did promise Douglas, who comes from Chile, who came to me, now I'm going to talk a bit about Douglas. Do sit down, sir, and I'll do that for you. But Douglas came to me yesterday, and he said, I have watched just about every video you ever done. And he had. He had an astonishing knowledge, and he had got a huge notebook with a list of about a dozen actually quite difficult scientific questions, which we went through over a cup of coffee, and I did my best to answer them. And he said, I do want you to give the civil service definition of a spade. This, of course, comes from the EU classification of goods in transit. And so it goes like this. We wouldn't call it a spade because that's too simple. No, we call it a one-person operated, manually controlled, foot-powered implement of simple and robust, yet adequately efficacious lignometallic composition, designated primarily, though by no means exclusively, utilization on the part of hourly paid operatives deployed in the agricultural, horticultural, or constructional trades or industries, as the case may be, for purposes of carrying out such excavational tasks or duties as may from time to time be designated by supervisory grades as being necessary, desirable, expedient, apposite, or germane with regard to the ongoing furtherance of the task or objective in hand, or, on the other hand, underfoot, Secretary General.